I used to believe that family was everything, an unbreakable bond, a sanctuary of unconditional love. I thought that no matter how cruel the world could be, family would always be my safe haven. But life has a cruel way of stripping away illusions, and when the truth finally hit me, it was like a gut punch I never saw coming. It started with little things. A missed phone call, a favor ignored, a subtle shift in the way they spoke to me, like I was an outsider in my own bloodline. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was overthinking. But the more I ignored it, the more obvious it became. Family isn't always about love. Sometimes it's about obligation, and sometimes it's about control. By the time I realized the truth, I had already sacrificed too much. My time, my peace, my sense of self. I learned too late that the people who are supposed to love you the most can also be the ones who hurt you the deepest. And when that realization hit, I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to walk away. This is my story, the story of how I learned that sometimes family isn't forever. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who distanced themselves from family. Growing up, I was taught that blood ties were sacred, that no matter what happened, you always stood by your family. But what happens when that loyalty is one-sided? When the love you give is never returned in the way you need it? It wasn't just the neglect, the unspoken competitions, or the favoritism. It was the way my accomplishments were diminished, the way my struggles were ignored, the way I was made to feel like an outsider in my own home. I would sit at the dinner table and realize that no one really saw me. Not the real me. They saw what they wanted. Someone who fit their mold, someone who lived by their rules, someone who didn't make waves. The breaking point came when I needed them the most. I was going through one of the hardest times of my life, emotionally drained, financially unstable, and desperate for support. I reached out thinking they would catch me, but instead, I was met with indifference. Excuses, dismissive words like, "You'll figure it out," or "You're overreacting." That's when it hit me. I had spent my whole life showing up for them, but when it was my turn, no one was there. I sat alone in my apartment that night, replaying every moment of my life when I had bent over backward for them. The times I had dropped everything to be there, the sacrifices I had made, the pain I had swallowed just to keep the peace. And for what? To be an afterthought? To be treated like I was only useful when they needed something from me? That's when I made my decision. It wasn't an easy one. Cutting ties, or even just creating distance, from family is one of the hardest things a person can do. There's guilt, fear, and that little voice in the back of your mind that whispers, but they're still your family. But I knew that staying in that cycle would only break me further. So I started small. I stopped answering every call immediately. I stopped saying yes to every request. I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided it wasn't enough. And for the first time in my life, I prioritized myself. The backlash was brutal. Suddenly, I was the villain. I was ungrateful, selfish, and dramatic. They twisted the narrative, painting me as the one who abandoned them, as if they hadn't abandoned me a long time ago. But I held my ground. Because here's the truth I learned too late. Family isn't about shared DNA. It's about who truly stands by you, who respects you, who loves you without conditions. And sometimes the people who claim to be family are the ones who hold you back the most. Walking away hurt, but staying would have destroyed me. And in choosing myself, I finally found the freedom I never knew I needed. The silence that followed was deafening. At first, I kept checking my phone, half expecting someone to reach out. Not to ask for a favor, but to actually ask about me, to see if I was okay. But the days turned into weeks, and the realization settled in. They weren't coming. I had spent years convincing myself that if I just did one more thing, if I proved myself just a little bit more, they would finally see my worth. But the truth was, they saw it all along. They just never valued it. That truth hit harder than I expected. Some nights, I lay awake, torn between relief and heartbreak. Because as much as I knew walking away was the right choice, the grief of it was real. I wasn't just letting go of toxic relationships. I was letting go of the idea of what family should have been. But in that emptiness, something unexpected happened. I found my people. At first, it was subtle. A friend checking in on me when they didn't have to. A coworker offering support with no expectation of anything in return. The barista at my favorite coffee shop remembering my order and asking how my day was. Little moments that reminded me that love isn't limited to blood. It's in the people who show up no matter what. And for the first time in my life, I let them. I let myself lean on others without guilt. I let myself receive love without feeling like I had to earn it. I let myself exist without the weight of trying to be enough for people who never truly saw me. Months passed, and with each one, I felt lighter. The anxiety of their opinions no longer held me hostage. The guilt of putting myself first faded into the background. And when the messages finally came, because they did come, I saw them for what they were. Not concern, not love, but control disguised as obligation. I didn't fall for it this time. Instead, I replied with the simplest, most powerful word I had never allowed myself to say before. No. And just like that, I was free. Not free from the past, it would always be a part of me. Not free from the pain because healing isn't linear. But free to build my own version of family. One that wasn't based on duty or guilt, but on choice. And that was everything. As time passed, I started redefining what family meant to me. It wasn't just about who I was born to, it was about who showed up, who stayed, who cared without conditions. I found family in friendships that had been there all along. In late-night talks with people who truly listened. In the quiet reassurance of those who made me feel safe. But healing wasn't as simple as walking away. Some wounds ran deep, and the echoes of the past still haunted me. I'd catch myself hesitating before opening up to new people, afraid that love always came with a hidden cost. I'd feel a pang of guilt when I spent holidays without them, wondering if I had made the wrong choice. And on the hardest days, I questioned everything. Had I really been mistreated, or had I just been too sensitive? That doubt was the hardest part to silence. Then, one day, I got a call from my mother. My heart clenched when I saw her name flash on the screen. It had been months since we'd last spoken. I hesitated, then answered, bracing myself for whatever guilt trip was about to come. She didn't waste time. "You don't call anymore," she said, her tone sharp, as if I was the one who had disappeared without reason. I took a slow breath. "I needed space." "Space? From your family?" she scoffed. "You act like we're strangers." The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. I wanted to say, "That's exactly how you treated me." But I didn't. I had spent enough time trying to make them understand, trying to explain my pain to people who never cared to hear it. Instead, I simply said, "I'm not doing this anymore." She paused. "Doing what?" "Fighting for a place in a family that never made room for me." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then, with a sigh, she said, "You're being dramatic." And just like that, I knew. Nothing had changed. They hadn't missed me. They had missed the version of me that was always available, always obedient, always putting their needs before my own. I wasn't that person anymore. So I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding my entire life and said, "I hope you're doing well, but I have to go." Then I hung up. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. That was the moment I knew I had made the right choice. Because real love doesn't demand your suffering. Real family doesn't hold you hostage with guilt. And if I had to choose between being alone and being in a family that never truly loved me, I would choose myself every time. In the weeks that followed, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and an unexpected sense of peace. I had spent so much of my life tangled in the idea that family was something I had to hold on to, no matter the cost. But now, with that weight lifted, I was finally starting to live for me. The holidays came and went. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to sit at a table where my presence was tolerated rather than cherished. Instead, I spent Thanksgiving with a close friend and their family. People who laughed freely, who didn't hold unspoken resentments, who welcomed me as if I had always belonged. On Christmas, I curled up on my couch with a book, a glass of wine, and a heart that, while still healing, felt lighter than it had in years. But healing is never linear. One night, as I scrolled through social media, I saw a picture of my family, smiling, laughing, gathered around the dinner table. My stomach twisted. It was as if I had never existed to them, as if my absence hadn't left even the smallest gap. A painful thought crept in. Did I ever really matter to them? I almost reached for my phone, almost sent a message, almost let the guilt pull me back into the cycle. But then I reminded myself of all the nights I had felt invisible while sitting right next to them, of all the times I had been dismissed, overlooked, made to feel small. I reminded myself that leaving didn't erase me. I still mattered, even if they never acknowledged it. So instead of breaking down, I closed the app, took a deep breath, and focused on the present, on the people who had shown up for me. And slowly, I started building a life that felt like mine. I poured my energy into friendships that felt like home. I found joy in little things. Sunday morning coffee runs, spontaneous road trips, moments of quiet contentment that didn't require anyone's approval. And as time passed, something incredible happened. I stopped waiting for them to care. I stopped looking for their validation, their acknowledgement, their love. Because I had found something better. Love that was chosen. Love that was given freely. Love that didn't hurt. One day, I may cross paths with them again. Maybe they'll realize what they lost. Maybe they won't. But either way, I know this. I am no longer waiting for a family that never truly saw me. Because I have finally seen myself. And that's more than enough. Months turned into a year. And with every passing day, I felt less like the person they had molded me to be, and more like the person I was always meant to become. At first, the emptiness was loud, like a house too big for one person, filled with echoes of what used to be. But as time went on, I realized it wasn't emptiness at all. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to grow. Space to exist without walking on eggshells, waiting for the next passive-aggressive comment or silent judgment. I built my own traditions. I celebrated birthdays with people who actually wanted to be there. I started Sunday morning coffee dates with friends who felt like siblings. I surrounded myself with people who chose me, not out of obligation, but out of love. Then one day I got a message. It was from my sister. "Hey, I know it's been a while, but I was wondering if we could talk." I stared at the words for a long time. My hands trembled slightly as I hovered over the screen, debating whether I should respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect myself from reopening old wounds. But another part, one that still remembered late-night whispers as kids, inside jokes only we understood, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone in my family finally saw what I had seen all along. So I replied, "Okay, let's talk." We met at a quiet cafe. The moment she walked in, I saw the hesitation in her eyes. She looked nervous, maybe even guilty. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but it wasn't what she said next. "I should have stood up for you." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard. "Why didn't you?" She sighed, looking down at her hands. "Because it was easier not to. Because if I acknowledged how they treated you, I'd have to admit how they treated me, too." I felt a lump rise in my throat. For so long, I had assumed I was the only one who had suffered in silence. But maybe we had both been drowning, just in different ways. "I miss you," she whispered. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe I hadn't lost everything. Maybe I hadn't left everyone behind. I took a deep breath and met her gaze. "I miss you too." And in that moment, I realized something. Walking away hadn't been about abandoning family. It had been about refusing to stay where I wasn't valued. But for the ones who were willing to grow, to acknowledge the past, to try, maybe there was still a way forward. Not back, never back, but forward, together. Reconnecting with my sister was both healing and unsettling. It made me realize that not everyone in my family had been the enemy. Some had simply been bystanders, too afraid to challenge the status quo. She had been one of them, and now she was trying to break free just as I had. We started talking more. At first, it was cautious, short texts, a few coffee meetups. But over time, the walls between us began to crumble. She admitted things I had never known. How she had been jealous of my strength. How she had stayed quiet out of fear. How she, too, had felt the pressure of expectations but had chosen to comply rather than resist. I thought if I followed the rules, they would love me more, she confessed one evening as we sat in my apartment. But it was never enough. Just like it was never enough for you. I nodded, understanding in a way only someone who had lived through it could. But as much as our relationship was mending, I wasn't naive. She had reached out because she wanted change, but the rest of the family? They hadn't. They were still the same, still wrapped in the illusion that I was the problem, that I had betrayed them by choosing myself. And then, one evening I got another message, this time from my mother. We need to talk. It's time to stop this nonsense. I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. I should have expected it. The silence had lasted too long. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they had lost control. My sister, sitting beside me, saw the message and let out a deep sigh. Are you going to respond? I thought about it. About the years of manipulation, the guilt-tripping, the way my feelings had been dismissed time and time again. But I also thought about how far I had come, how much peace I had found since walking away. I looked at my sister and gave her the most honest answer I could. I don't know. That night, I sat with the message longer than I should have. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. So many responses running through my mind. What do you even want to talk about? What nonsense? But deep down, I already knew how the conversation would go. They wouldn't apologize. They wouldn't acknowledge my pain. They would demand, manipulate, insist that I come back into the fold. And I wasn't willing to do that. So I made a choice. I didn't block her. I didn't respond with anger. I simply replied with the truth. I found peace, and I'm not willing to give that up. If you want to talk, really talk, I'm open to it. But if this is just another way to dismiss my feelings, I'm not interested. I hit send. Minutes passed. Then hours. Then a full day. No response. And I knew then that I had made the right choice. Because family should never be a cage you have to escape from. Family should be a place where you are safe, seen, and loved. And if my family couldn't offer that, then I was better off without them. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no response from my mother. No follow-up. No acknowledgement. Nothing. At first, I felt a familiar pang of guilt. That old instinct that whispered, maybe I should have said more. Maybe I should have tried harder. But I caught myself before I fell into that trap again. I had spent my whole life trying, and it had never been enough for them. The truth was, they weren't upset because I had left. They were upset because I had stopped letting them control me. And I refused to go back. My sister, however, stayed in my life. She wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but we were learning together. Some days, she struggled with the weight of still being in contact with them, torn between loyalty and her own growing understanding of what we had been put through. I never pressured her to choose. Instead, I told her what I wished someone had told me years ago. You're allowed to put yourself first. That doesn't make you a bad person. She held onto those words, and slowly, I watched her begin to set her own boundaries. Maybe she would fully break away one day. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, I knew one thing. She would never be alone in it. And neither would I, because I had built something better. A life filled with love, not obligation. Friendships that felt like family. A sense of self-worth that no longer depended on their validation. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict. Not just the quiet that came from walking away. But real, deep, soul-healing peace. The kind that comes when you finally accept that you don't need to be loved by people who refuse to see your worth. The kind that comes when you finally choose yourself. And I had. For the first time in my life, I had chosen me. And I had never been more free.